Good evening. This evening we're going to look a little bit about the halachas of STaM, particularly of mezuzahs, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have a little bit more knowledge about what is required to ensure that mezuzahs that you're using for mivsoim or your own use in your own houses are kosher. Obviously there's no substitute for having your mezuzahs checked by a sefer, by a magir musmach, but this at least is giving you some basic idea of the sort of things you should be looking at and to be an educated consumer. So most STaM is sold out of ignorance, not fraud. It's difficult to believe that from Yidden are bedafka selling stuff which is possible, but unfortunately their primary parnasa is as a shopkeeper. Their job is not to be a sefer, and often they don't know exactly what it is that they're selling and all the different pratim. So in order to prevent this, we need to educate ourselves. Business works very simply on the principle of supply and demand. If customers ask for something, the shopkeepers will supply it. If there's no demand for poor quality STaM, then there'll be no reason for shops to sell it. So the best way to stop poor quality mezuzahs and tefillin being sold is to stop asking for the cheapest level, poorest quality of mezuzahs. Just to share with you a letter that was sent from Shlomi Gestetner of Mayanot to one of the Sofrim, and this was just after Rabbi Gutnick had given a session at the Kinnis HaShluchim on Sofras. And he writes, very often students come to Mayanot with their tefillin that they bought through their Chabad house. Often after learning at Mayanot for a while, they realize they need to check their tefillin. And unfortunately, when they do, they're surprised to find that their tefillin are b'diavad or chas v'shalom posel. Many of the students have bought their STaM through their local shliach, and it can cause an enormous amount of damage. Clearly, it's not the shliach's fault. The shluchim aren't suffering. Shluchim are relying on the dealers who are supplying to them, and it just shows how important it is to ensure that when you purchase, if you're a bacher going on mivsoim and you're supplying mezuzahs to one of your balabatim on your mivsoim route, that you know where you bought the mezuzahs from and that you bought them from a reliable, trustworthy source, ideally direct from a sefer. So if we look at the market, only about 20% of the mezuzahs on the market are kosher. You've got an enormous amount that is sold either printed on paper, and it still goes on, printed onto parchment. People are becoming increasingly technologically advanced. It's relatively easy to print something with an inkjet printer and for it to look as if it's absolutely kosher. People silk screen mezuzahs, and mezuzahs that are scribbled, or sometimes mezuzahs are written on klaf mashurach. Again, this is less prevalent now. And the problem with klaf mashurach is it's a klaf that's been painted to make it smooth and easy to write with, but eventually that paint starts to crack and the letters crack as well. And if you look at who's written mezuzahs, the majority, unfortunately, are written by people who are not suffering. Somebody may have dropped out of yeshiva, learned how to hold a kolmos or a pidograph or a calligraphy pen, and writing STaM. Some are written by non-Jewish people, they're Arabs who write tefillin, they're women who write tefillin. This is nothing new. If you go back years ago, it was well known that in Europe before the Milchama, in the city of Slonim or the city of Mir, there were Sofrim that would be sitting, writing on Shabbos, smoking their cigarettes. So it's not a new problem. Vad Mishmar STaM has made tremendous strides in licensing Sofrim, giving them training, ensuring they've taken the fahers and had shimush. So the situation is improving all the time, but unfortunately there's an enormous amount of schera out there that's come from sources that aren't acceptable. Who checks our STaM? So you bought a mezuzah and it's got a nice little sticker on the back, and it tells you that the mezuzah is computer checked. Does that mean anything? So you've got a mezuzah, and it's got a sticker on the back. You can see the sticker. The sticker simply tells you that the mezuzah has been computer checked. It doesn't tell you that the mezuzah is kosher, because what the computer is checking is it's checking that the spelling was correct. It's not necessarily picking up every issue of the source of the Yosef form and the letters, and the computer only flags up the mistake. If the person operating the computer ignores a warning flagged up by the computer program, then the mistake can slip through the net. So who's checking your mezuzahs? The base level is what's known as a seicha hagar. Most of the mezuzahs that you're buying haven't come directly from the sefer. The sefer is selling his mezuzahs to a wholesaler known as a seicha, a merchant, and that seicha is then selling on to the shop. The seicha will employ somebody to be magia to check through the mezuzah. They'll check hundreds of mezuzahs at a time. They'll charge about $1 a mezuzah, and the quality is not very reliable. It's very common to look at mezuzahs that have been officially checked, and there'll be tagging missing, there'll be negiyas, there'll be all sorts of problems. Some sochrim are more makpid, and they'll employ their own magia who will go slowly through each mezuzah. It costs a lot more money. It's adding a significant amount onto each mezuzah. So if you're buying the cheap end mezuzahs, it's more likely that that mezuzah has not been thoroughly checked. And it's also a common misunderstanding that every sefer is a magia. A sefer needs to know how to write, and the sefer is tested to make sure he knows the halachas of ksiva, the halachas of lishma, of kasidron, of chokteichas, and so on. But he doesn't need to know all the what ifs. He knows how he should be writing. He doesn't know all the halachas of what is the situation if something goes wrong. That's the job of the magia, which is more specialized, requires a separate ksav kabbalah. The ksav kabbalah to be a sefer doesn't include ksav kabbalah to be a magia. There's a lot more halachas. You need extensive shimush to ensure that you are qualified to be a magia. So again, just giving your tefillin or mezuzahs to a regular sefer is not necessarily guaranteeing that they're going to be properly checked. There are many sofrim that are magim as well, but not every sefer is a magia. Can a mezuzah that has every letter written correctly be possible? Is it shaykh? You can take a mezuzah, you can read it, and the mezuzah will look 100% kosher. So there are many halachas relevant to STaM that can't be determined after the mezuzah has been written, lishma. You have to write the mezuzah l'shem kedushas mezuzah. There's no way of knowing that unless you've got Ruach HaKodesh. How are you going to know what the sefer had in mind? The mezuzah has to be written in order. So if you missed a word out and then went back and filled that word in, nobody's going to be able to tell after the mezuzah has been written. But that mezuzah is 100% possible. Chokteichas means that the letters, it says uchasavtam, the letters have to be written. They can't be scraped away. So for example, if a blob of ink falls on the cloth and you take a knife and scrape it to make it a hay, it may look like a kosher hay, but that's 100% possible. If you've got a letter ches and it was supposed to be a letter hey, so you scraped away a little bit of the left-hand regel to turn it into a hey. If you're very, very careful, you may be able to do that without it being apparent. But that mezuzah is 100% possible. Similarly, Kiddush Hashem. Every time that Hashem's name is written, you have to be Mekadesh that Shem. You have to say, Hareini Kesav, L'Shem Kedushas Hashem. There's no way of knowing after the mezuzah was written whether that was done or not, unless you got Ruach HaKodesh. There's a very famous story of when the Rebbe sent somebody, told somebody to have the mezuzahs checked, and they were checked once, and they were checked twice, and they were checked by expert sofrim, and they kept writing back to the Rebbe, we've checked the mezuzahs and they're okay. And eventually it was brought to Rav Landau, and Rav Landau looks and can't see a problem. So he calls in the sefer and he says, there must be something wrong here. What's going on? Tell me, how do you write? What are the halachas and so on? And it comes out that the sefer said he's very makpid to go to mikveh every time he writes Shem Hashem. But it's not shaykh to go to mikveh multiple times in a day. So what he did was he would leave a blank where Hashem's name should be. He'd then go to mikveh, come back and fill in the Shem Hashem. So tremendous kedusha and kavanah for the ksiva Shem Hashem. But the mezuzah was 100% possible because he hadn't written it in order. And it's only somebody like the Rebbe with Ruach HaKodesh who can discern that after a mezuzah has been written. So all this demonstrates why it's so important to ensure that the source that you're buying from knows who wrote the mezuzah and can testify that the sefer was a sefer musmach, the sefer had a ksav kabbalah, the sefer knew the halachas of ksiva. So let's look, here's a great example. Right? The word, this is from Yemechem. Yeah? Look at the letter. If you look at it very closely, I'm not sure how well it will appear on your computer screen, but if you can look at it very closely, look at the letter Yud. And you'll see there's a very faint shadow under that letter Yud, as if it would appear to me that actually the sefer made a mistake and wrote it as a vav, and then very, very carefully corrected the mezuzah to turn it into a Yud. That is a problem of Chok Teichas. He's not written a Yud, he wrote a vav, and then he made the vav into a Yud by scraping it out. Can you passel a mezuzah like that? It's very difficult because you don't know. Maybe it was done as the sefer was writing. Maybe he made a mistake. He wrote the vav, he scraped out the whole vav and rewrote it as a Yud. It's difficult to know. But an experienced magir, that will start to ring alarm bells. And you'll then check it twice, 3 times, 4 times. Normally, if you check that mezuzah extremely carefully, you're going to find that there is something else possible in it, because the sefer, who is not makpid on Shalei Kesidron, is often missing out other issues as well. If you've checked the mezuzah very, very carefully, you haven't found any of a psul, it's very difficult to turn around to somebody and say the mezuzah is pasul on the grounds of that. You can explain to the person exactly what your suspicions are, and then it's that person's decision whether they want to upgrade or not. Let's look at this parasha from Tefillin. I'm going to try and blow it up a little bit. See if we can make it. I'm not sure if we can make it a bit bigger. Somebody's asked what is the passwords they can join on another device. If Igor Yeshivas Lubavitch could share that with Shmuel Yechilevich. Thank you. I can't really blow this up much bigger, but if you look very carefully at the letter Vase. So if we look at this letter Vase, what do we see? We see that the letter Vase has got no akev. It's got a base, has to be square, and it should have a little belita, a little akev, a little heel sticking out to make it a very clear base. This doesn't have any of that. If you also look, you see that the sefer is all over the place. He's not writing on the sirtut. Now, there's no chiyuv for parashas of tefillin, unlike mezuzah. There's no chiyuv for tefillin to be written on the sirtut. But again, this is screaming out to the magir. This sefer didn't know what he was doing, and it's very clear that this is somebody who wasn't used to writing properly, and therefore it's almost certain that if you check this parasha carefully, you're going to see. First of all, you can see again there's loads of osios that are missing Tagim. So the shin, the gimel, the langanun, the ayin. So again, this is screaming out to you that whoever wrote this parsha really didn't know what he was doing. Let's look at another example again of a mezuzah that appears to be written correctly, but hasn't. So you can look at the zayins, and again, it looks like these zayins have been scraped away. It may well be that these zayins were both langanuns. Now, it's possible that they were just a little bit too long, and the Sefer did a Shilas Tinuk, and the Tinuk read it as a zayin, in which case you could scrape away a little bit so that somebody looking at it in the future doesn't have that same Shaila. But it could be that it was a langanun, and it was possible, and they still just scraped it away to make it kosher. So again, this is just showing how important it is for the mezuzah to be checked by a Magiya who absolutely knows what he was doing. Let's look at this vase. Yeah, Hadvarim. So look at it very carefully. I've blown it up quite big so you can see it quite easily. To me, it looks like this was a chof. It was a chof, and the Magiya has added a little uketz and a tag to try and turn it into a base. And I would be almost certain that this is something that was done afterwards. Sometimes you can tell if you look very carefully. In the original, you can sometimes tell there's a slight difference in the shade of the ink. Particularly a lot of the cheaper Magim aren't using a kulmus with ink to fix up things. They're using like an ink pen type of pen, an architect's pen called the rapidograph. And very often the ink is a slightly different shade. So when you look at it, you can tell it's been added on later. So this was probably written as a posel mezuzah with a chof instead of a vase. And then somebody came back and added on something to it. Here again, another example. Yeah, v'haya im shamaya. If you look very carefully, you can see that the word im has been scraped away. They made the shloss mem a bit longer and the shin a little bit longer. And again, it's almost certain, I would say, that this has been written afterwards. Because there was no need. Why did he schlep out the shloss mem and try and schlep out the shin to try and reduce the gap? So reduce the gap between im and shomaya. If you look at the original here, you can see, even here you can tell, even on the photo, the right part of the shin and the left part of the mem are much darker than the rest of the ace. It was done at a later stage. Even if he'd written v'haya im, he could have scraped out the im and just left it as it is. He's worried there's slightly too big a revach to make it. Maybe it's a chash of a new parsha. You could make, there's ways to be masakin it. You can make a little hole in the clef. So again, it's almost certain that whoever did this was being masakin it shalei kasidron. These are things that are very difficult to discern when you're looking at it with an untrained eye. And that's why it's so important that when you give your mezuzahs, yes, it's very good that when we go with Soyim, we have a quick look at the mezuzah. Sometimes you can have a straight away see there's a letter missing, there's a word missing, there's a word that's cracked. But to never substitute that if there isn't a psul that's screaming out at you for a proper check by a Magir Musmach. So what are the golden rules for buying mezuzahs? First of all, make sure that whoever you're buying from knows where it came from. Make sure that the person you're buying from is a Magiya himself, so that even if they're not writing the mezuzahs, they are checking every single thing that passes through their hands. if you're buying tefillin, make sure that the person you're buying from has actually seen the parshas and the batim separately, and it's being put together under his control so that he can testify that the parshas have been checked, that the parshas have been put in the batim the right way round. If the parshas are put in upside down or in the wrong order, you've got a problem. That the batim and the ritzuas are kosher. It's not enough just the parshas, and that the hechsher includes the painting. The batim often will have a hechsher, but the hechsher is on the raw batim, not on the painting of the batim. The batim could have been filled with glue and all sorts of other issues. You want to make sure that not just your parshas, but your batim and ritzuas are kosher. And any seicher who is a genuine seicher will give you a lifetime no quibble guarantee. Obviously, they're not giving you a guarantee against defects due to wear and tear. So if for example, the parshas develop cracks or the ink fades, nobody can give you a guarantee against that. But if there's ever a psal, even if it's 10 years later, that supplier should be ready to say, I will swap it for you at no charge. And if they're reluctant to do that, why? If the price seems too good to be true, it probably is. There's going to be a reason why the price is so low. Somebody's cut corners somewhere. And again, ask mezuzahs that possible. If the sefer's uncomfortable with it, say, are you happy to give me the mezuzahs unwrapped so that you can have them checked by somebody else? Anybody who's got any worry about that, again, why? What are they worried about? What don't they want? I'm not saying that they shouldn't wrap them up for you, but they should be in principle prepared to do this, because anybody who's not prepared to do any of these things, the question you've got to ask is why not? What are they worried about? Before selling anything to somebody, explain the different levels of kashrus. So if you're selling to a balabos, don't tell him you're getting him a top level mezuzah. If you're selling him a 10 centimeter mezuzah, you can explain to him you're giving him a 100% kosher mezuzah. But, and you know, balabatim can relate to very gashmistic of things. Tell him, I'm not selling you a Jaguar, I'm selling you a Fiat Punto. It's a good car. It'll get you from one end of your journey to the other. It's roadworthy, it's past its MOT, but it's not got all the bells and whistles that a top level car. And they can often understand something like that. Just as another, people often ask for the smallest mezuzahs. One thing that I will sometimes do, I'll show them a 20 centimeter mezuzah, and they'll say, have you got anything smaller? And then you show them the 10 centimeter, and they're happy. If you show them the 10, they're going to ask for something smaller and want the 6 or 7. So show something much bigger, and then when you show them the regular size or the smallest possible kosher size, the 10 centimeters or the 12 centimeters, they'll be happy. 6 and 7 centimeter mezuzahs are not always possible, but the likelihood of being so is much greater. In fact, I would say that probably 90% of the small mezuzahs that I've checked, maybe even more, have had problems. It's very, very, very rare to find a small mezuzah that's kosher lechatchila. And if it is, then that mezuzah should be costing significantly more. There are some sofrim who will custom write a small mezuzah for you. And that small mezuzah can be absolutely beautiful, but you're going to be paying significantly more than you would pay for an entry-level mezuzah for that one. Anything that's costing you less than $40, $45 in the United Kingdom, anything much less than about £38, £39, is probably going to be problematic. Because remember, the shop's making a markup, and then from the shop making the markup, the seicher, the wholesalers, also had to make his markup, and they've got to cover their overheads, their building and costs, their insurance, their taxes, and everything else. So by the time you get down to what the seifer has paid, take off the cost of the cloth and the ink and the fact that every so often he'll write a puzzle one that he can't sell, is certainly not going to be earning more than about £9, £6-7 an hour. So ask yourself, if somebody is writing for £6-7 an hour, who's going to be writing those mezuzahs? Similarly, pshutim mudarim for less than about $375, $400, and gas is less than about $550. Almost certainly,
you're going to be having problems. And even that is absolutely on the border of the very, very lowest possible price that you could get for something that's kosher lechatchila. Anybody who tells you that you've got gases for $550 on the Mahuda, I'm not sure that that's definitely the case. So now we can begin to understand why the cheap stuff on the market may actually not be kosher or very questionably kosher. In order to sell at such a low price, the Sefer is writing very quickly, scribbling and showing very little concern for the halacha. You may find a beautiful mezuzah. This is a mezuzah, very nice ksav. It's being sold on eBay. If you look closely, it's sold by somebody called Hasoferet. It's a lady. She's actually very refreshingly honest. She actually writes on her eBay site, mezuzahs written by women aren't accepted by Orthodox Judaism. Please don't buy this mezuzah for use in Orthodox homes. But many people don't read that, and many people don't worry about that. That's just, the frummer, and they'll buy this mezuzah off eBay. It looks a beautiful mezuzah. You can send it to be magir, and it's going to be very difficult to find a problem with it. But it's 100% problematic. So, as I said at the beginning, you can't replace a proper check by Magir Musmach. I'm going to share with you a few basic things you can look for before you buy a mezuzah. The absence or presence, depending on the issue, should set off an alarm bell. So first of all, as we said, check that the mezuzah is being computer checked. This is a basic to pick up the chos of the yesas. The reality is that we read the Shema every single day, and therefore it's shayach that you can read something and read it once and twice and three times, and sometimes you'll have a mezuzah or tefillin that's been checked by a couple of different people, and they all missed the mistake. So computer checking is very useful for help with the chos of a yesa. The sticker should have been removed. If you bought your mezuzah and it's still got the sticker on, whoever put that mezuzah together for you clearly didn't really know what was going on. On most stickers it says, please take this sticker off. Computer check isn't a guarantee that the mezuzah is kosher, not a substitute for a regular check. It's supplementing it. But virtually every reliable sefer will ensure their STaM is computer checked. The absence of it should sound an alarm. Why? Check the back of mezuzah. Check that the shin daled yud and the kuzu are present. If they're missing, it's a clear sign the mezuzah wasn't checked. Why did the magir not pick up this very simple thing? Make sure that the shin daled yud is opposite the space before the hoya on the other side of the mezuzah. The kuzu it should be opposite of the shem, Elokeinu Hashem. The kuzu is actually al pi Kabbalah. You've got it. You add it. You're moving one letter forward each time. So chof instead of yud, vav instead of hey, and so on. Right, and so this is writing out. It should be in the right place. Doesn't make the mezuzah puzzle if it's in the wrong place, but if it's in the wrong place, again, it's screaming out. This sefer didn't know what he was doing. If the sefer was lazy about this, what else were they lazy about? Check there are no extra or missing letters. We read it in Shulchan Aruch, the dakdek ma'od, the chaseris v'yiseris. We have to be very particular that there's no missing letter and no extra letter. Shimchasa yate eisachas, if there's one letter missing or one letter extra, psulin at tefillin, the tefillin are 100% puzzle. And the person putting them on is saying every day a bracha levatala and not being mekayim the mitzvahs tefillin, but nimsa einish hasefer meruba. Therefore, lochein tzarich liyos yorei shemayim v'choyled v'Hashem. You have to be a great Yireh Shemayim in order to be writing tefillin mezuzah. It's not just I've got nothing else to do, so it's a nice way of earning a bit of money. The gam tzarich lahazir the limchos b'sofrim nichem narem nichtot tefillin mezuzahs. You have to warn and complain about those sofrim who allow young bochrim to write tefillin mezuzahs, and if they see that the mezuzah ended up nice, they'll sell it. Now he's at the end of the day still a young bocher, and who knows, he's not able to be mechavan with the kavanah. His kavanah is to have a nice writing. Lislame, to learn to write. Lisragel, to practice. The lo shem kedusha kavanas mitzvahs b'olam. He's not got in mind the kedusha and the kavana. Einish sefer meluba ma'od. Also litin es adin or kabel onshei haba ma'od. All of nema, all malech, all esam lech Hashem l'miyah. Lochen yizar kol sefer mizev tovlei. The Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Siman Lamed Beis, Seif Lamed Gimel. So have a look at this mezuzah. Tell me if you can find where the mistake is. Anybody can see the mistake? Type it into the chat. Anybody spotted the mistake? Anybody? V'ahavta es Hashem elekecha v'chol. So what did it say here? It should be v'chol levavcha. Here it says uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol nafshecha. Yeah. So nice ksav, pretty nice ksav. Svardish are pretty nice. A couple of other issues. It's like negir here or there, but 100% possible. Yeah. V'chol uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol nafshecha. Right here on the second line. Here's another one. Yeah. Tell me what you can see from the psul in this one. I'll give you a clue. This was a mezuzah from a couple who unfortunately for many years did not have children. Yep, correct. A and G has got it right. Instead of saying v'limadatem eisom es benechem, ukeshautam eisom es benechem, you're tying up. And Nebuch, this couple, never had children. Nice ksav, 100% possible. Yeah, let's look at the. Anybody tell me what the problem with this one is? Somebody said we can't really know that this was the reason they didn't have kids. Absolutely not. We can't know the reason, but certainly having a mezuzah, which or tefillin, which are apostle, and the psul is directly linked, certainly doesn't help. Yeah, A and G got it again. La'os al, you can tell slightly because actually in my original picture I had a red circle around it, and then I just slightly tried to rub out the red circle so you wouldn't immediately see where it is. But yes, kshartum la'os instead of al yodcha, kol yodcha. What else can you do? So first of all, very simple. Anybody can read from mezuzah. If you're on Mifsaim and you read the mezuzah and you see one of these psulim, straight away the mezuzah is possible. There's no issues there. You can straight away deal with that. Let's look at the next inyan, negias. Check there are no letters that are touching. Uchsavtam, dolshu chachamim sheiksav v'shalim sheitidbek eizachas bechaverta. You have to make sure that the letters are not touching. Ela kol eis teimu kefes gvil michol ruchiseh. Every letter has to be surrounded by the parchment on all sides. Pertaining to Yeges Kilchasa has to have all the correct tags on it. Commercials Barber Simon Lamed Vav. If it's a large letter and it's stuck at the end, that you're able to scrape away the book, the negia, the place where it's touching, and you still have the source Eis. Yesh misha machshir. There is those who are machshir afalei grira. This is a radach, right? And brought down in the Shutarashba, based on Kol Roila Bila Ein Bila Ma'akeves. However, what does the Alter Rebbe write? Yesh lahachmir v'ligrei. We should be machmir, and we shouldn't be seimach on this. We have to make sure that we've separated the negir. But we're going to see that this isn't so straightforward. Not always are you able to separate a negir. Yeah? Even if it's just a tag, afilu im eina istvuka ba'atzma, a tag shaleisu davar b'tagay sacharis, it's just a tag that's touching. Yesh lahachmir l'sakim b'grira. Afilu im togay sachas dvukim sebeh, even if on the same letter, and this is quite common when people write in a hurry, that the tagim on the particular letter are touching each other. Tov l'saknon k'moshius bava siman lamavav. The tikkun me'elaf b'tfilim mezuzahs. Some of these negiyas, the tikkun helps even with tfilim mezuzahs, and it's not considered shalei kasidra. However, this is not so straightforward. Yeah. If because the letter has been nishtana, because it's stuck. So for example, let's say you've got a chof and a vav, and the chof and the vav have a slight negir, but that chof and vav has now turned into an ois mem. In such a case, it doesn't help to be masakin it. And you have to actually rub out the entire part that was possible and rewrite it. And obviously, in the tefillah mezuzah, that's not going to help you because you're going to have a problem of shalei kasidron, because you're going to have to rub out until the tzuras ha'os is no longer nikah, and then rewrite it. That's in Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Chof Ches. Similarly, if you've got, let's say, a hey or a kuf, and the regel of the hey, yeah, the regel of your hey is touching, it's a little bit too close, or the kuf, afilu negir daka kachut hasayra shutzuras maleim, v'atinik koira kilchosa, the kid still read it as a hey, mikol mokim, kevijutzach ligret chila kol regel. You've got to rub out the entire regel in kain shuvein tzuras maleim. It's no longer going to be a hey. And of a case when you rewrite the regel to make it into the hey, how you case of belay shalei kasidra. Any other negir that the way to be machshir it, were it to be a sefer Torah, is to rub out that part that was written b'psul until it's no longer recognizable as an ice. By tefillin and mezuzahs, you can't be misakin it again. It's going to be shalei kasidron. That's in Alter Rebbe, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Lamed. So read through the mezuzah. Check that there are no missing letters and no extra letters. You're not an expert, so don't rely on your own check totally. If you spot something wrong, then clearly there's a serious problem. Just for example, the word mezuzahs, the first time it's written, it's spelled with one vav. The second time with two vavs. The first time the word lotitofis appears, it's without a vav, and the second time with a vav. If two letters are touching, the mezuzah is possible. Sometimes this can be corrected, but until it's been corrected, the mezuzah should be considered possible and not be used. This is particularly common in the cheaper mezuzahs where the writing is often very cramped. If you've checked the mezuzah and it's got negias, that's screaming out to you and telling you that the sefer himself, who was magirit, probably wasn't magirit properly. So here you go. Look at this letter, right? V'cho, chof, vav. Very slight negir, but this is 100% kosher mem. So no good. There's no way that you can second this. If you've got a shin, if it was just a very thin negir between the two roshim of the shin, maybe you can be misakin it. But in this case, where you got a thick negir, you'd be mafsid at tzuras ha'os. It's no longer a proper shin. It's going to be very problematic to be misakin that. Even if the letters are not actually touching. And this is a very important statement about magnifying glasses. A magnifying glass only helps if you've got, let's say your eyesight isn't that great and you just want to confirm something, but using a magnifying glass is fine. But if you look at this letter here, and it looks to you like a mem, and if you go right close up and put on a pair of glasses, a magnifying glass, you can realize that actually it's a chof and a yud, and there's a slight gap between. It doesn't help. That is going to be considered a
mem.
Yeah. Also, I mean, another problem. This yud's a very young yud. It looks slightly like a vav as well. So I would say that a mezuzah like this, where it looks almost totally like a mem, that is a very serious shaila. Again, ayin and vav. I've magnified this enormously. When it was at the original size, this was quite a small mezuzah, and at the original size, this looked 100% like a shin. And there was a shailas tinuk, and the tinuk read it as a shin. Even now, when you magnify it tremendously, you can see that actually it's an ayin and a vav. Being that at normal size, it looked 100% like the shin, and the child read it as a shin. That is a problem, possible. Check that the tagim are present. Yeah? So we read Aisha Shatnas Getz, Vuadin Nun Pshuta Vetzadik Fufa, Bekal Mokim Shehem Sach Lezayna Bishleisha Tagim Ktanim. So these 5 letters, Shatnas Getz, and the 7 letters, Shatnas Getz, and the Langa Nun and the Langa Tzadi have to have 3 tagim on the top. It's very common on cheaper mezuzahs that the tagim are not touching the actual top of the letter. Some sofrim are lazy. They don't put any tags on, and they get somebody else to come afterwards. They write in the mezuzah. It's much quicker. They give it to somebody else afterwards who's using one of these rapidograph pens, and so that all his job is to put tagim on the mezuzahs. And again, they'll very often miff them off, or they won't write them properly. Every tag, the tagim shouldn't be touching. You have to even second it lechatchila. B'di'eved, after also lem klal tagim ksherim. V'yesh poslim im leitig shatnis gates. V'yesh lochich l'deveim le'achem v'shal toilet takna. So the Alter Rebbe says that we should be machmir. We should make sure that all these tagim are in place. It's not a problem of shaloi k'sidron. Filim moil tikun v'eim b'zeh b'shum shaloi k'sidron. Ha'il v'gufa ois suras elei. You've got the suras ois, and therefore the ois is kosher, and you can fix it up. But again, many cheap mezuzahs have lots of puzzle tagim. Part of the problem is, particularly on the very small mezuzahs, it's very difficult to fix up, because if you try and fix this mezuzah up after it's been written, you may well end up smudging or making a negia and causing more damage than you've done. Missing tagim don't necessarily definitely make the mezuzah possible, but it's a clear sign that the mezuzah hasn't been checked properly. In many cheaper mezuzahs, the tagim are missed off and left to the matayig. Not only that, but the daya that the mezuzah is kosher even without tagim is referring to a situation where the letters ayin, tes, and so on were written with a square head, and that can be considered a tag. But in many cheaper mezuzahs, the mezuzahs are rounded, and even b'di'evad it's possible. Here's an example how the matayig added on the tagim, and what did he do? He put the tag right there in the middle, and actually made this how can we, other small mezuzahs not written according to the Alter Rebbe, how can you force the stringency of the Alter Rebbe on them? The Alter Rebbe, we're not talking about the Alter Rebbe's ksav here. What's written in the Alter Rebbe is not the stringencies of Alter Rebbe's ksav. This is, we paskin like the Alter Rebbe. Let me tell you something very interesting. I had a shaila once, which I was discussing with a Litvish Dayan, and he turned around to me and he said, "You're a Lubavitcher. You need to paskin like the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek." So the fact the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek are the Dover Achrein for us, And if that's what the Alter Rebbe writes, then that is what we are. That's what we are taking as our loch. It's not saying we're being machmir as a labavitch chumrah on somebody else. That's number one. Number two, this issue. I'm quoting you here. Labavitch, as we're using the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. But if you go in the Keses HaSefer, you go in the Mishnah Brura, the same halachas are written there about the importance of Tagim and so on. But as I say, what we're looking at here is a situation where somebody's added a tag and made the mezuzah 100% possible because he's now taken away the whole surah sa'is of the tzaddik. He's filled in that gap in the middle. Tagim on the lamed. Tagim on the lamed, the Alter Rebbe right now. This is ANG. I'm not sure what your name is, but this is something that is perhaps more negeya to your question here. Al pi asaid, sarach lius la shtei tagim al reish tzavar, yemin usmail. Yemin agadol usmail akotan. There should be two al pi Kabbalah, two tagim on the top of the lamed. Yemin is chesed, smail is gvura. So we want the yemin to be miskaber. Now, if somebody comes to you and they've got a problem, a health issue, it may well be that the shefa of ruchnius is being stuck because the lamed has got gvura more than chesed. Is that an issue that passes the mezuzah? 1,000% not. But if somebody's come to you with a specific issue, you can point out to them and say there is such an Indian al pi Kabbalah. It may be worthwhile thinking about. Can you be passel such a mezuzah? Absolutely not. And what fascinates me is that there'll be some sofrim who are absolutely caught up on the Tagei Lamed and be makpid on every single lamed, but they'll miss out posher to inyonim as well. I mean, it's interesting. For example, the Alter Rebbe also writes Al Pi Asaid, the right-hand side of the chatiteres of the ches should be thicker than the left. The chatiteres is a triangle that's connecting the vav and the zayin of the ches to make it a ches. And the Alter Rebbe writes, Al Pi Asaid, the right-hand side, I've seen very, very few sofrim, even good sofrim, that are makpid to do that on all their cheses. So yeah, this is a hidur. Certainly, if you've got a mezuzah can be 100% kosher lechatchila without the lamans. What more worrying to me is when you're selling somebody a 15 centimeter mezuzah and the sefer has not been makpid on the tagei lamed. You're selling something that's supposed to be a mohuda mezuzah and they're missing tagei lamed, or they're not being makpid on the tagei lamed. That's a much bigger question. Can you sell something to somebody as Mahadrin when some of the Hidurim are missing? Check that the letters have no cracks. If the letter's cracked, it's usually possible. Sometimes the crack can be fixed. If it's a crack that's a hefsek she'einin nikela hedya, then when you look at it at a normal distance, it looks like a letter, then it doesn't look like there's a crack. Then that could be masakan. But again, if your mezuzah's been checked properly, if this is a new mezuzah, there shouldn't be cracks. You've got a mezuzah, sometimes they're rolled up a little bit too tightly. They're squeezed into a case. That can sometimes cause problems with cracking. But certainly, in a fresh mezuzah, you shouldn't be having, and if the mezuzah's rolled properly, that's why it's also important, don't fold the mezuzah, don't fold filling parshas. With mezuzahs, you should very carefully roll them. Use like a round pencil, wrap it round the round pencil to make sure that you're rolling it carefully, not putting any creases in it. With the parshas, you roll it and then you very carefully pinch it so that, again, you're not putting sharp creases. So if we look at this letter tes, yeah? So the letter tes has got a little crack at the bottom. It doesn't look like two letters. Okay, the right-hand side looks like a nun, but the left-hand side doesn't look like anything else. Again, this is very magnified. When you looked at it in original size, it didn't. When you looked at it from a normal distance, it wasn't hefsek shenikala hedya. You could be masakin it. But look at the other letter, the letter tzadi. You've now got here, even though it's only a very slight crack, this is a nun and a yud. This is Ksav Beis Yosef. It's not Arizal. Arizal, you've got a backwards Yud, so you wouldn't have that issue being Ksav Beis Yosef. You've now got a Nud and a Yud. That's a problem that you can't be Masakin. Let's look at this letter Aleph again. If you look closely, you'll see the Yud is disconnected. It's not looking like two separate letters over here. It's a Yud, but the bottom part doesn't look like an Eis, and therefore, being that it was a Hefsek She'ein Nikala Hedja, you could be Masakin this with in a mezuzah or tefillin, and it wouldn't be Shaloi Kesidron. If we look at this letter, look at the Mem. It's turned now, we've got a crack at the top. It's turned into a Chof and a Vov. Because it's turned into a Chof and a Vov, it's two letters, and you can't be Masakin it. As we read in Shulchan Aruch, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Lamed, Afilu b'makim she'ein sarach grira klal aksiva mashu bilvad. You're not scraping away now, you're writing something. Mikol makim ima eis chalukah lishtayim v'niris k'shtei eisios. The letter's divided in two, and it looks like two eisios. Kigein sadi shekosva yud nun, eishin shekosva ayin yud. Aval pisha tinnik she'ein chachim kaim kil chasin ein yochel esakne achakach. Kimishainenu reish yesh lem tzuras eisios acheres. Im kein kishmasakne achakach is eksiva Keksiva michodosh, is a case for shaloi kesidra. Check the spacing. If two words are written too closely together and they look like one word, or two letters are written too far apart and the word looks like two words, then the mezuzah is possible. Again, usually a sign that the mezuzah hasn't been checked properly. So look at this here. Mitzvah sai asher. Right? It looks like one long hemshech of a word. If you're a very good sefer, you could probably be masakin this without an issue. You could make the sof slightly longer at the top, so the yud looks very clearly now that it's a chelek of the word mitzvah sai. Then scrape away a little bit of the aleph, and you'd probably have a big enough gap then between them, the mitzvah sai and the asher, to be okay. But again, you've got to look. There's no ironclad rule. It depends on how the sefer's writing. If the sefer's leaving slightly wider spaces between each of his letters, then so you've got to look at every different mezuzah, tefillin. What's the way that sefer's writing? Does it look here? The sefer's leaving quite wide gaps between the letters and quite wide gaps between the words. This mitzvah sai asher is totally out of sync with the rest of the mezuzah and looks like one word. Okay. Again here, Hashem Noisein looks like one long continuation. Look at this. I've actually very nicely highlighted it for you already. There's missing Tagim. Why is there missing Tagim over here? Because there's a langer chof on top, and the sefer was worried that if he wrote a tag, it would be nichnas into the halal, into the airspace of the langer chof, and turn it into a hay, and that would be a problem. But again, this is very simply laziness. Firstly, if you space things properly and take your time, you won't run into that issue. And secondly, if you're very careful, there's no shear for Tagim, no shear, no minimum size. You could write 3 very small Tagim, which would be 100% kosher. Instead, because it's more complicated to write slightly very small Tagim, and to be careful that you're not going into the airspace of the langer chof, they decided just to miss it out totally. If you see on a lot of small mezuzahs, you'll sometimes see a little thing at the bottom, almost like a stamp engraving. That's almost always, virtually all of those mezuzahs that have this little stamp at the bottom are they're very small mezuzahs that are almost guaranteed to be possible. Again, the ones that you get, the small mezuzahs, you get in these nice little plastic bags, these 6-head mezuzahs. Mughal you gave Magir STaM. There was that's 100%. Virtually every single mezuzah that I've ever seen with that packaging has been possible. Let's look at another mezuzah. So what's the issues with this letter mem here? All right. So here you've got an extremely long chartam of the mem, much lower than the bottom, much wider at the top. It's an interesting shinai. I should definitely have to do a shilas tinuk to see whether that was okay. Again, with your vase, your top is much longer than your bottom. It's kosher b'diavad, but again, it's screaming out to you that this is a very poor quality. Your langa chof is also a problem here. Your shins have got very long roshim. So again, it's screaming out to you that whoever wrote this mezuzah clearly wasn't paying attention, didn't know the source of Aishas properly, and there's a big shaila whether he knew all the other halachas as well. Anybody can spot the problem with this mezuzah. If you look at this mezuzah, you've got a zayin, which is almost certainly considered a vav. You've got a chof with a major shinoi tzura. It's not got a proper guf of the chof. It's just two pieces stuck together. You've got the vase where the moshav is much shorter than the top. Again, a very unusual vase. But the main problem with this one is your zayin, which is almost certainly a vav and posel. So that's some of the problems that you have with lower end schira. You'll also get problem at the high end. The Rebbe greatly encouraged the use of Alter Rebbe's Ksav. But Alter Rebbe's Ksav is very difficult to write properly with all the diyukim. And if you're not writing the Alter Rebbe's Ksav with all the diyukim, then you've not got the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. You've got the Arizal with a few kvetches, but it's not the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. So you've paid significantly more than you would pay for a good quality Arizal, but you haven't received what you've paid for. You've dafka wanted to be Mekayim what the Rebbe said about using the Ksav Meyuchas, and you've been prepared to pay extra for that. But what you haven't got is what you paid for. A lot of young Sofrim are being taught straight away Alter Rebbe's Ksav. And they've never written Arizal Ksav. They're going straight in at the deep end, and they're selling it, and that should be treated as entry-level Ksav. Nevertheless, the way the market works, that anybody who churns out something of Alter Rebbe's Ksav is going to be able to charge a premium, even though they may not have the diyukim of the Alter Rebbe's Ksav in their particular writing. So again, we're not saying that you shouldn't be buying. Absolutely, Alter Rebbe's Ksav written properly is what we should be aiming for. But have we actually got what it says on the box? So if we look at some of the issues that you can sometimes find with the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, you've got a lamed here, which doesn't, the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, the ratio of the lamed is much narrower than an Arizal Ksav. But instead of actually having a narrow rosh, they've literally got just a line with a tag. which there's a big shaila as to whether that is a properly kosher lamed. Look at the difference here between two shins, two Alter Rebbe's Ksav. Properly written Alter Rebbe's Ksav with the shin with a slanting base. This one's got an almost flat base. That's not a proper Alter Rebbe's shin. It's a shaila bichlal if it's a proper shin. A shin's supposed to have a slanting base. Look at the mem of this Alter Rebbe's Ksav, where there's a little belita at the bottom, the chautam of the vav of the mem, but here the belita is coming much too far out, and that's a shinoi tzura. That is not so. You've got here you've got a reasonable mem, but here this mem is a major shinoi tzura here. Is that a kosher mem? It's a good shaila. The same thing we mentioned with the reish of the lamed. You've got the same problem with the reish of the aleph. And again, in this aleph here, the circle around it, you can see it's difficult to say that that's the reish of an aleph, that has got the tzura of a reish. Another thing you'll sometimes find is that the angle that they're putting the reish of the aleph is totally incorrect. So you've got somebody who's trying to follow the diukim of the Alter Rebbe, but questionable whether indeed they've actually done so. In fact, perhaps they've even written something which is certainly very questionable towards the side of a psul. Again, somebody who's having difficulties writing the Alter Rebbe's base. The Alter Rebbe has a very unique base, slightly curved and slightly angled. And here, they've curved it so much, it's very korev to being a chof. And again here, very korev to being a chof here. Is that an akosha Alter Rebbe's base? Or is that a chof? B'derech klal, just another thing to be aware of. Sometimes when you take a very nice, good kosher mahuda Alter Rebbe Ksav to a sefer who's not familiar with Alter Rebbe Ksav, he'll tell you there's problems with it, which is just simply because he doesn't know the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. But here we're talking about problems that are nothing to do with the Magir not knowing Alter Rebbe's Ksav. They're issues which are problematic. So when you are buying Alter Rebbe's Ksav, make sure that you know who the sefer is, that the sefer is somebody who's got experience, and that the sefer is writing all the asiyas uniformly, not just 50% of his asiyas, but every single ace is being written with the diukim of the Alter Rebbe every single time. Just a couple of simple things with regards to fixing mezuzahs, and b'derech klal, another thing to be aware of is that a person may have 100% kosher mohuda mezuzahs, but if he's not got them on all the doors, or if they're on the wrong place on the doors, so somebody may take their mezuzahs and send them for checking, and they may come back kosher l'mahadrin, but the person didn't know where to put them up, or he was missing a mezuzah somewhere, then he's still got a problem. Many, many times when the Rebbe wrote people badikas tefillin mezuzahs, the problem was that the door was missing a mezuzah in the first place. So an important part of Mifsayim is making sure that when you speak to the balabas, you're not only telling him to get kosher mezuzahs, but that somebody should do a tour of their house. And nowadays with phones, it's very easy. If they don't want you tramping around the house, they can take you on a FaceTime tour of their house. They can hold the camera and walk around and link into a rov and make sure that all their doors have got mezuzahs and in the right places. Make sure that outdoor mezuzahs are properly sealed so that they can't get wet, they're not near sprinklers, and they're not in direct sunlight. If you've got a mezuzah in direct sunlight in a clear, transparent case, you're going to concentrate the sun's rays, and you're going to end up with a mezuzah that's burnt to ashes from the strength of the sun. And I've seen that even in England, where it very rarely shines, the sun very rarely shines. I saw recently a mezuzah that was totally charred because it was on a front door in a clear plastic case. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea of, we're not going to deal with tefillin tonight, a little bit of an idea of some of the halachas when they get to the kashrus of mezuzahs. If you want to learn a little bit more, first place to start, the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Siman Lamed Beis to Lamed Vav. The classical Sefer on Safras is Keses HaSefer, written by the Mechaber of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, who pretty much based his Suras HaIsius on the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. A Sefer called Mishnas HaSefer, which was a Rav in Bnei Brak who wrote a commentary on the Keses HaSefer. Eishus Harav is by Rav Moshe Weiner, a Lubavitcher, who's a mumche in Alter Rebbe's Ksav. Ksav Chabad also gives you an overview of the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, and Pischei Sha'orim is a sefer that gives you an enormous amount of information about which doors are chayav in mezuzahs and all the different scenarios. If you want to read something in English, there's a book called Inside STaM by Reuven Mendelovich. He's a out-and-out litrak, and he writes very clearly that Ksav Beis Yosef is preferable to Arizal, which would certainly have a problem with somebody saying that. But if you just look at the other issues, ignore that particular issue, take the good parts out of his book, he does give a very good overview of what to look for when buying STaM. So I wouldn't necessarily say go and buy it, but if you can buy it from a library, it's definitely worth reading. So hopefully, and two other things, if people are interested in these inyonim, there's in English and in Lashon HaKodesh, there's what's called the International STaM Forum, where Sofrim and Magiyim post shailas, share discussions. It's fascinating to read. In Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew STaM blog spot from Moshe Weiner, and some of the illustrations I shared with you this evening are from Eli Gutnick and from Weiner, who gave permission for them to be used. So hopefully that's given you some overview of some of the issues. I'm going to unmute everybody. If anybody's got a shaila, please feel free now to ask for another few minutes. Happy to stay on and answer any questions. What safeguards are there in the UK? There are no safeguards in the UK other than making sure that you go to a sefer or Magia rather than going to a high street shop. And if you're going to the high street shop, ask them, where have you got them from? All those rules I gave at the beginning, where have you got them? Can you tell me who the sefer is? Do you give me a no quibble money back guarantee? And if the person's happy to give you all those no quibble guarantees, then you can rest assured that you're doing well. Thank you to Rabbi Itzinger and the Igud Yeshivas Lubavitch for the amazing work that they're doing with the shiurim that they're putting on for the Bachrim who aren't all able to be in yeshiva at the moment. And I think Balabatim, Shluchim were all enjoying also listening to many of these wonderful shiurim as well. So a big yishakech, Rabbi Itzinger.